and welcome to Unscripted. I'm Kavit Hafwai. In this edition of the program, we have the pleasure of having Louis Allday join us. Amongst the things that he's the founding editor at Liberated Texts. Liberated Texts is a book reviewing and publishing projects that are dedicated to republishing works that have been neglected, overlooked, and suppressed in the mainstream since their publication, and he joins us now. Louis Allday, welcome to Unscripted.
Thank you very much for having me.
We're going to start with a quote from you, and this was taken from an article which was very, I must say, eye-opening in terms of the different parameters you set forth in this particular entry. The first one, I'm going to quote, "Genocide in Gaza, how the Al-Aqsa flood changed the world, fundamental changes that is clearly irreversible to have magnified, clarified, in some cases, accelerated pre-existing issues." Can you name some of those pre-existing issues that you mentioned here to have been accelerated as a result of October 7th?
The thing that immediately comes to mind hearing that question is the complete hollowness and superficiality of the liberal human rights discourse and the kind of so-called rules-based international order that we have seen the obliteration of over the last 18 months, whereby primarily the US, but also the UK and Germany and others have essentially sacrificed the post-World War II international order that they had created themselves in order to indefinitely sustain a colonial genocide. And I think now, perhaps more than ever before, of course, many people were already aware of how superficial and how self-serving such notions of human rights and international norms and measures and protections were. But I think we have now reached a point where now globally, people more than ever before can see just what cheap, hollow words and institutions these things are and were. And I think that also applies not only internationally in terms of the use of of violence, but also in terms of supposed European values or Western values, freedom of speech, freedom of gathering. The reactions we have seen, I would say primarily in the US, but not solely in the US, including even again ostensibly liberal, enlightened countries like Holland, where student protests protesting against the genocide have been beaten, tear gassed, shut down by any means possible. And so I think one of the reasons I said intensified is that these things were already happening and they were already known by some people, but I think we've now reached a point where probably more people than ever before, including probably people that would previously not have considered themselves particularly political, have now had their eyes open to things in a way that I think cannot go back.
Indeed. I'm not acquainted with you, but hearing you speak, I sense and I feel a passion in your voice generally, but I'm guessing that it is also because of the topic that we're discussing that I feel a kind of pain that is underneath the sentiment that you're expressing here. Am I correct to sense that?
Yeah, you're very correct. It's not even really underneath. It's quite on the surface. I think it's very. I have been impacted, like so many millions of others. I have been impacted very deeply and emotionally by the events of the last 18 months, and I think, kind of to relate it to the first question, I think one of the painful realizations is even someone such as myself, who, before October the 7th, was, politically aware, politically active, did not consider myself to be naive in any shape or form. If you had told me, let's say 1 week after October the 7th, that the genocide would be continuing in May 2025, I would not have believed it. I couldn't have necessarily given you a clear answer of what mechanism or what pressure or what it would be that would have stopped it. But there was something in me, perhaps naive, perhaps overly optimistic, that did not want to believe that we could live in a world where this could pass in the full eyes of the world, and still to this very moment be continuing. So yes, you're right. It is painful to talk about, and of course these issues are not just. It's not just Gaza. It's Lebanon. It's Yemen. They bombed the airport in Yemen, I think, an hour ago. So yeah, you're right. There is pain and emotion in the way I talk about it.
So let me ask you this: when you have mentioned to have obviously witnessed what you have, and this is set to be the event, this genocide, to be recorded in real time. I'm sure you've heard that, and for the whole world to see it unfold in front of their eyes on the TV screens. The question I have is, if that is the case, which it is, then what is the deal with people who are questioning whether this is a genocide or not? What is the deal with, for example, I'm not putting down the ICJ or the ICC or any other organization like the UN, where they come out and they use words like alleged or, not somewhat skirting the issue, where it's obviously there. And therefore then, what about accountability? Isn't the world failing in that respect?
I mean, undoubtedly, and again, that relates back to your first question, that these supposed global mechanisms to try and impose a sense of justice or legality have just been revealed to be essentially powerless. As to why differing groups and different people are casting aspersions or doubting whether a genocide is happening, I don't think there's one answer. Some people, it's just completely cynical lying because they're Zionists and they are basically aligned with what's happening. I think some people, there's probably a degree of ignorance and apathy. And I think to relate it to what I know best, the UK, and I would imagine probably the West generally, there is quite an ingrained idea from education that the truth always lies somewhere between two opposing points. So if I'm very strongly advocating this and you're advocating this, there is a kind of default response that, well, neither of them can be true. It's got to be somewhere in the middle. So you'll find people that will say, oh, of course Israel has gone too far, or, that it won't be an entirely crude pro-Israeli, pro-Zionist position, but there will be this instinctive aversion to fully side with the oppressed, because there's an idea that, it's always got to be, they've got to inject some kind of nuance into it. When, of course, in this situation, probably more than any other in the world, it's not nuanced. There are nuances, obviously, around the edges and within certain things, but this is fundamentally a case of colonial genocide being enacted in front of our eyes, and there is no nuance there. And then I suppose probably an additional factor is some people are scared for their jobs and their standing and their perceived professionalism or objectivity. Objectivity, very much in quotation marks, because it's objectivity determined by the parameters of the US, basically. And obviously, over the last 18 months, there has been numerous examples of people being suppressed or sacked or forced to leave the US or forced to leave other countries for various reasons. So I think, in answer to your question, it's not one single reason. It depends on the context. But I think a big factor is, and one other thing, you mentioned people are watching this on their TV screens. Increasingly, something I've noticed in the UK is that it's not being shown.
Really? How so?
In terms of one of the most powerful kind of means of propaganda is omission. Obviously, especially early on in the genocide, there were attempts to shape the narrative in a way that legitimized it. And I'm not saying that has stopped, but I've noticed one of the biggest ways of justifying it now is just by not reporting on it, or not reporting it in the same, in a prominent way. It's not on the headline page. I occasionally torture myself by checking out all the main, BBC, etc. It's nowhere near as prominent as it was a few months ago, even though, as we know, the situation is worse than it was a few months ago. And then you have very duplicitous institutions like The Guardian that ostensibly provide an alternative, and they do superficially in some ways, but then on a kind of fundamental level, will still the narrative will still remain Zionist. It will still remain anti-armed resistance, and so there is a kind of network of media personalities and institutions whose role is essentially to suck up the righteous anger and outrage that people feel, but then make sure that it is funneled in a certain direction, and which essentially leads back into a kind of soft liberal Zionist position that delegitimizes Palestinian armed resistance, that implies there is a kind of redeemable Israel that can exist, implies or says outright that the occupation began in 1967, not 1948, and many other things. So yeah, there are a lot of reasons to put it in short.
Well, the last piece of news that there's plenty of news out there regarding the Gaza Strip and the Palestinians there, but one of the ones that made headlines, at least here, I'm not too sure if it made it in the UK or other places, was the fact that there was a flotilla that was targeted by the Israeli regime forces. I believe it was through a drone, and that was supposed to deliver humanitarian aid because they've stopped it. Now, the immediate question is, what do you think about this? But my question is, if you recall, it was about 4 or 5 months after the genocide began that the U.S. made this grand announcement. The Army is building this barge that is supposed to deliver humanitarian aid. And then the EU came out and said, from Cyprus, we're going to deliver. They spent $450 million. Nothing came out of it. What kind of impression do you have of that?
Specifically that barge, that pier construction, as far as I could tell, that was used in some kind of special forces operation. I think there was maybe a propagandistic element to it, because at that point in time it served their purposes to imply that they were somehow involved in a humanitarian action, but I think it was actually primarily used to land special forces of some kind that then went on a rampage and killed. So it was not really the humanitarian purpose that they had in mind?
No.
And as for the drone strike recently in Maltese waters, that again, it shows just fundamentally how there are no red lines. There is nothing, at least on a moral level, there is no act that Israel can take that will not be greenlit and supported by the US and the collective West. And I think, if a comparable act had taken place, a different country, an official enemy of the US had drone striked an aid ship with, volunteer civilians on board, that would have been rolling, constant streaming and coverage and outrage and condemnation after condemnation after condemnation. And of course, we haven't seen that. If anything, we've seen some wishy-washy, we are concerned by, or, the typical kind of obfuscating language. And I'm finding myself actually, I obviously I was outraged and angry, but I was not surprised.
Really? Mm. You mentioned Yemen. I'd like to find out what you think about the fact that you have, for the first time, Yemen exercising a naval and air blockade because of the fact that there was news that came out, ratified by, I guess, the Knesset, that they have decided to overtake all of the Gaza Strip. Yeah. And they're calling up the reservists to do that. So Yemen has reacted. The actions by Yemen are actually in accordance with international law.
I was about to say the same thing. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So why is it that they're the ones that are being accused in the way they are and being blamed for what they're doing, when in essence, and being called, by the way, a terrorist entity, the Ansarullah movement, when it's the ones committing the genocide are the Israeli regime forces with the help of the U.S.?
Because, to put it bluntly, because international law is only valid so long as it serves the interests of the West. The moment that it doesn't, it's either ignored or, in the case of Yemen, that, as you say, is essentially carrying out actions in accordance with at least elements of international law. They're being criminalized, demonized, and now directly bombarded because of it. And actually, I think one of the dangers, maybe danger is too strong, but it almost is now, I think, irrelevant to some extent whether what Yemen is doing is in accordance with international law, because it's clearly in accordance with morality for any person that can see that. The same thing applies to some extent to Palestinian armed resistance, which, again, is fully in accordance with UN international law. UN declaration and international law built on the premise of that, which calls for the right of occupied people to use any means necessary to resist occupation, including armed struggle, explicitly. But I think even if that wasn't the case, again, from a moral perspective, a colonized people, an occupied people resisting their oppressor is always going to be a moral position. But you are right that there is maybe an irony here that it is Yemen that is essentially following international law in many ways and being, now not only lied about and demonized for it, being once again bombarded.
We've been very proactive writing about the Palestinian cause, and I'd like to reference what you wrote for Mondo Weiss back in May 24, 2024, where there was 4 points on solidarity after the Gaza genocide. You mentioned one of them, which was armed resistance. Tell us what this entry is all about, and we'll get into each one of these, because really each one of them has so much weight, and maybe we could start with the armed struggle part, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I actually can't believe I wrote that 1 year ago. And again, it comes back to that point of naivety. I'm not even sure if 1 year ago, if you had told me in 1 year's time, you're going to be talking about the article and the genocide is not only continuing, but worse than it was then. I don't even know if that incarnation of myself would have, it's like this continuing process of thinking, oh, I was naive then. And it just doesn't, as you said earlier, before we started filming, there's no clear end in sight. So I think that piece was motivated by what I saw as, and it's not something I haven't written about before, but frustrations and limitations I have with the way in which a lot of solidarity in the West is expressed, and the kind of a lot of the analysis and ideology behind solidarity with the Palestinians in the West. Because, as I'm sure you have seen, there has been all over the West, US and across Europe and elsewhere, huge, in some cases, protests. And there is a clear, very clear, increasingly clear distinction between the policies of the governments of these countries and, if not a majority, a very, very significant proportion of the populations of these countries who are disgusted by what Israel is doing. And that is obviously a good thing. However, large segments of that solidarity movement, especially prominent individuals and a lot of the organizations within that solidarity movement, I do think some things have changed and shifted for the better to some extent since I wrote that article, but a lot of the things still apply. There is a lot of solidarity in the abstract and a lot of kind of general ahistorical sense of solidarity, but accompanied by a lack of solidarity with the actual movements, peoples, nations and states that are supporting and fighting the Palestinian cause. And I have felt for many years a significant disconnect in a lot of the discourse around solidarity with Palestine in the West and the actual reality now of the Palestinian cause. In a way that often, so as one example, a lot of the understanding of the West's role is premised on a quite misleading and simplistic idea of the Jewish lobby or the Zionist lobby, in a way. And that's not to say that there is not significant Zionist lobbying interests, there are, but to focus only on that and not look at the broader context of imperialism, initially Britain's role in establishing the Zionist state and why it did, and now the continued imperialist role through the US and the role that Israel plays in the US imperialist system, not only leads to, I think, misunderstandings of what's happening and why, it also perpetuates the myth, basically, of a redeemable United States or a redeemable UK, that if it were not for the Zionist lobby, their policy on Palestine would somehow be moral or better or improved, when we know it's actually perfectly in accord with their policy on virtually every other issue in the world. It's not an anomaly. So it makes no sense to blame solely the Jewish lobby as though its inhumane policy towards the Palestinians is anomalous when it's not. Another very significant limitation is the rhetoric and the discourse around armed resistance. I should caveat that one reason for that in the US and the UK is that it is now actually very dangerous from a legal perspective to talk about these things, or at least to talk about specifically prescribed organizations. So that is one limitation. But in the case of the UK, for example, in the prescription of Hamas, this problem predates that prescription. So it can't be put solely down to people being, legitimately and understandably afraid of actually facing serious legal consequences. And also, I think there is a distinction between expressing support for specific groups and a more fundamental moral, ethical position around the use of violence. And I wrote an article in 2021 about exactly this issue, which is kind of a longer version of that specific point in the article that you mentioned, which basically argues that it's not the place of those standing in solidarity with the Palestinians or any other group of oppressed people to dictate how they should resist that oppression. And if your solidarity with a group of oppressed people is incumbent upon them remaining victims, then your solidarity is essentially worthless.
So a quick segue here to the protests. And my brain was a little left behind from what you mentioned before, but I remember how the UK had some of the biggest protests, pro-Palestinian protests, solidarity with Palestinians against the genocide. I think after Yemen, the UK was setting a record there. What happened there? I mean, I'm sure there was a good promotion behind it. Nevertheless, it shows that people there in the UK do actually really care about this.
Undoubtedly, and I've been on many of those protests. There were a few in particular which were vast. Some of the big, I've been going to protests for more than 20 years. Probably the biggest, at least one or two of them, the biggest protests that I've ever been on. Easily, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people. One of them, there were estimates of maybe 1 million or more. So, relative to the population, it's huge.
Sure.
And of course, not everyone who feels that way can go on a protest. So you can maybe extrapolate out from that there are literally millions of people in the UK who are definitely, at a minimum, strongly opposed to this genocide and the role of the UK within it. Although I should say, and this is kind of related to the point about some of the limitations and the slightly ahistorical understanding of the solidarity movement, I think within the UK, there is, and I don't say this with aspersions to anyone because it's very hard to actually know. Not many people know the extent of the UK's involvement. Very few people know the extent of, the fact that as of a couple of months ago at least, the UK had flown more spy reconnaissance flights over Gaza than Israel itself.
Really? We were aware that this was going on, but not to that extent.
I think that was reported by an Al Jazeera investigation a few months ago. People don't know that. The BBC is certainly not going to report that. It's a handful of people and institutions or media organizations, that are talking about this. So I actually think that the opposition in the UK would be even more if people actually fully understood that the UK is not just, because for example, on those protests, a lot of the criticism would be that the UK isn't doing anything, i.e. it's not taking action to stop it, whereas, it is far worse than not taking action to stop it. It is and I would say it extends beyond complicity. It is a participant in the genocide, as is the US, obviously.
How does that make you feel?
More disgusted in my own government than I think I ever have before. it's reminiscent, I suppose, of the Iraq War. And again, I was under no illusions about the role of the UK in the world pre-October the 7th. But if anything, again, it comes back to that point, maybe I was naive, that it's actually even more insidious, more heartless, more destructive than I had fully reckoned with. And the protests obviously are ongoing in the UK. And I think one thing I have clarified in interviews and in things I've written before, me pointing out limitations and frustrations that I have with the solidarity movement is not, and I'm not attacking the solidarity movement per se. It's I want it to be more effective and have a better understanding of Zionism and imperialism to fully reckon with what's happening and why. Because I think an improved understanding is going to lead to hopefully a more informed solidarity movement that can be more effective. Because unfortunately, as you say, there's been huge protests, and it's not budged the UK government an inch.
Yeah. When you talk about the efficiency factor, for example, you do your part. You write articles and you do interviews, or you expose the truths or maybe things that the general public might not be aware of. But what else can be done here, and what can be done to make this efficient, as you said?
There's not an easy answer there. I think one of the most, I don't know if efficient is the right word, but I think maybe effective is a better thing. One of the most or impactful things that is happening in the UK context is an organisation called Palestine Action, which takes direct action, again in more ways than one, against primarily Israeli weapons manufacturers based in the UK. Again, I think that's something the general UK population is largely ignorant of, the extent to which we have Israeli arms manufacturers and factories active in the UK. For various reasons, family commitments, whatever it may be, not everyone is in a position or wants to take direct action, because direct action comes with it a very increased risk of imprisonment, sanction of some kind, and it's a very risky thing to do. But I think the role of others, perhaps myself included, if people have a better understanding and awareness of these issues, they're going to be far more likely to support and aid in whatever way their circumstances and abilities allow more risky actions such as direct action. So like with all these things, it's not a question of only one means of resistance or one means of protest being welcome and effective. I think many of these things can work well as a chorus of different tactics. Because obviously if you had no one talking and writing about Palestine and a handful of people taking direct action and no one understood why or what was even happening, the likely impact and effect of that direct action, however bold and however heroic, is going to be significantly limited compared to if you have in conjunction with direct action people and organizations and institutions educating people and exposing things.
Sure. Just imagine if we have a drawing board here and we lay out a long piece of paper and we put different issues that are involved in this genocide. If we were to take a look at what's happening, well, you have the U.S., and it's President Donald Trump who has said, I'm going to make the Gaza Strip the Riviera of the Middle East. I'm going to displace the Palestinians and offer them places such as in Jordan, Egypt, and I think the latest was actually Africa, which involved 3 countries there. So this is the approach that's being used. The Israeli regime has made it clear what it's doing, but there's not enough talk about the core issue, the occupation. That has to be solved. Why isn't there much more focus on that, if you agree with that, politically, to solve this situation so that trickle down to the general Palestinian masses?
If you're talking about the US has no interest whatsoever in solving the situation in a fair or humane way. It is it's abundantly clear now that the US is effectively given carte blanche to Israel to pursue what we all knew was its agenda all along. And, as you said, they announced just recently, yesterday, they fully announced their intentions now to fully take over the Strip, which is obviously a terrifying prospect. And if that is allowed to happen, will entail potentially even more deaths than we have witnessed over the last 18 months. But I think that speaks to the key and unique role of Israel within the global imperialist US system, that they are willing to, as I said at the beginning of the interview, they are willing to essentially demolish all these, structures of supposed rules-based order and human rights and all these paradigms. They're willing to basically tear those up to maintain the Zionist settler colony. And that's where we're at. And as much as they and others in their service, direct or otherwise, might try to portray the US as somehow still people do, as some kind of objective mediator, or, it's laughable. It was laughable before October the 7th. It's now, just beyond a joke.
The West Bank itself is experiencing outbursts of violence, even though it's been ongoing, albeit at a slower pace. But there are instances where it has extended to the point where people, analysts, periodicals, what have you, have said it's another Gaza genocide in the making. And I'm not too sure what your feelings are, but once the Gaza Strip situation, God willing, comes to some kind of solution, the West Bank is next. Do you think that is the case, and what's going to happen there?
I think that is extremely possible, and I think if the horrors we have seen in Gaza were not unfolding, what has unfolded in the West Bank over the last 18 months, would have dominated headlines of at least honest news reporters in the way that Gaza has, because there has been an almost unprecedented increase in all manner of violence in the West Bank. And as we are well aware, unfortunately, the Palestinian Authority are just enforcers of the Zionist state, unfortunately, at this point, and actively fighting resistance groups in the West Bank, who, as you say, if militarily the resistance in Gaza is defeated in some way, it's hard to see at this point exactly how that would happen, given they've not been able to do it after 18 months. But if that were to happen, or if, for whatever reason, in whatever way, Israel was able to pull significant numbers of forces out of Gaza and put them into the West Bank, that is a very, very scary prospect. And I think this comes back to the kind of the understanding of the importance of understanding the nature of the situation, and especially the historical patterns and historical context. And by that, what I mean in this context specifically is the inherently expansionist nature of Zionism.
Exactly.
Zionism is, by its definition, an expansionist movement. Palestinian writers such as Fayez Sayegh have known this since 1965. Because, to this very day, from its establishment in 1948 to this very moment, Israel has never officially declared its borders. It is it strives to be in a constant state of expansion. As we've seen since the overthrow of the Syrian government in December, it now occupies even more. It already occupied the Golan Heights. It now occupies even more Syrian territory. So there's no reason to doubt that the West Bank is at grave risk, and that risk will certainly heighten because its isolation will increase if Gaza is defeated in some way. So I think it's not implausible to think of that.
Well, the thing that comes to my mind is the fact that when you take a look at the history, and many people like to use the 1967 as a starting point in some sense, but really it goes back to 1948. And when you take a look at that, even before that, we are looking at an entity that has terrorism and violence as its core approach to the way that it has treated Palestinians, from a variety of violent actions that maybe you can give us some examples of, to the one that is a very prominent one, and that is the Nakba. So it shouldn't really be that much of a surprise that they have excelled in the level of violence that they've exercised, especially as we have witnessed it in this genocide.
And I think, of course, like you say, the Nakba in 1948 is the true starting point, in the sense that it's when the Zionist state was established. But of course, Zionist colonization actually began in 1882, the first wave of colonization. It was not a straight line of increasing colonization from that point, but the case in point being that, and also on the point of expansionism and the desire to essentially remove the indigenous population, Weizmann, one of the key ideologues of Zionism, said in 1919, so shortly after the Balfour Declaration, that their intention and their aim was to make Palestine, what they would come to call Israel, as Jewish as England as is English. And in 1919, 9/10 more or less of the population of Palestine were Palestinian, were non-Jewish, or not the Jewish settlers rather. So if that's your aim and that's the population composition, that aim can only be achieved by the removal, one way or another, of those people. And this ideology goes, right back to the origins of Zionism, because there is a very insidious and in some quarters still prominent liberal Zionist myth that Zionism was some kind of, indigenous rights liberation movement that at a certain point, usually 1967, turned sour and turned to the right and became corrupted. Whereas the reality is this is what Zionism has always been. And the only way to fully reckon with that and to fully understand the situation and how it must be resolved, at least must be resolved in a just, humane way, which is the dismantlement one way or another of the Zionist state as an ethnocracy that prioritizes Jewish citizens above anyone else. That cannot exist in a just solution.
Well, we are looking at a situation where no matter how much you read about the genocide, Palestinians being massacred and murdered, the immediate reaction that you have, the impulsive reaction that you have, or spontaneous reaction you have is, we need to stop this. There are ways that this can be stopped. The killing machine can be stopped if there was no energy in the form of gasoline being brought to the trucks that are going inside the Gaza Strip. The way that the Israeli regime, using the land of Arab countries, where trucks are delivering necessities of a variety, but yet that those Arab countries are not stopping that, they're participating in it. How does that make you feel when you know that fellow Arabs that should be helping the Palestinians are not doing that?
I think that is probably one of the most, there are so many disturbing aspects, but one of the most disturbing aspects is that there is a whole international infrastructure being deployed to sustain this genocide. And it's not just, traitorous Arab states like Jordan or Egypt or others that are involved. Turkey is intimately involved, Azerbaijan is intimately involved, countless others that could be mentioned, all of them geared towards sustaining indefinitely the Israeli military's ability to commit a colonial genocide. And just to reckon with that is the world that we currently live in. And the countries like Yemen, like Iran, who are actively opposed, are few and far between. And those forces that have taken stands, whether they're organizations such as in Lebanon or nation states that have taken a stance, have paid a very, very heavy price for it.
Indeed. And I have one last question, and that is the fact that over the course of the past interviews that I've had, on more than one occasion I've had the person I'm interviewing say that the Israeli regime is unraveling. And in two cases they said there's going to be a civil war inside occupied Palestine. Do you believe that that is the case? And I'm going to quote what you have written, if you don't mind, where you said, Israel must come to an end. The Zionist entity commonly known as Israel is a settler colonial project sustained by U.S. imperialism for its own purposes.
I mean, the short answer is I do believe that. But the longer, maybe less satisfying, less happy answer is I don't think it can be taken for, well, two aspects of it. I don't think it can be taken for granted. It's not necessarily a completely inevitable thing that's going to happen. And it's not, I think if you had asked me this 1 year ago, I probably would have given you a different answer. I do still believe that in the long term, the Zionist entity will not survive. It is an externally implanted, externally supported entity that cannot sustain itself. But as we were just talking about in the previous question, there is an international infrastructure led by the US, but not solely the US, that is invested, at least for now, in the maintenance of that entity, whatever the cost to the Palestinians. So I think its long-term viability for a variety of internal and external contradictions and factors, the likelihood is it will end, but it's not clear to me that it's going to be soon. If the last 18 months and October the 7th itself has shown us anything, it's very difficult to say things with certainty now. And I would love to be surprised. But I think some people's predictions have been maybe excessively optimistic. And it's going to take more blood, more conflict, and probably more suffering in the region for Israel to eventually be defeated and dismantled.
All right, very well. Thank you so much, Louis Allday, for this interview.
Thank you.
It was my pleasure to hear the passion in your voice about a cause that is so important, as unfortunate as the genocide is. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
In this edition of the program. Thank you.
Thank you.